JD Vance's car rumbled over the uneven gravel road leading to Maple Creek Diner, the neon open sign flickering in the window against the dimming evening sky. The small-town eatery sat tucked between a hardware store and a gas station, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, or at least your business. Inside, the warm glow of hanging lights reflected off checkered floors, the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee drifting into the night air. It had been a long day. Too long. JD's stomach growled as he parked near the entrance. He'd been on the road for hours, making stops, talking to locals, and now, all he wanted was a quiet meal before heading back to his hotel. He wasn't here for a speech or a campaign event, just a plate of good food and a moment of peace. But as soon as he walked through that door, he knew something was off. The diner was half full, with families chatting over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, old-timers nursing cups of coffee, and a trucker flipping through a folded newspaper. The hum of small-town life. But the moment J.D. stepped inside, a shift rippled through the room, a pause in conversation, a glance, a murmur. Behind the counter, Talia, a waitress with tired eyes and a practiced smile, greeted him with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Sit anywhere you like," she called over the clatter of dishes, grabbing a notepad from the register. J.D. nodded. Sliding into a booth by the window, set his phone face down on the table. He barely had time to glance at the menu when a voice cut through the air, firm, unwavering. "Talia, come here." The voice belonged to Melissa, the diner's owner. She had emerged from the kitchen, still wearing a flour-dusted apron, her expression tight, her arms crossed. Talia hesitated before walking over. The two women spoke in hushed tones near the register, but J.D. didn't have to hear the words to know something was wrong. Then Melissa turned toward him, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The room felt smaller, as every pair of eyes followed her movements. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice controlled, but the tension underneath unmistakable. "But we can't serve you here." J.D. blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me." Melissa squared her shoulders. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance. I don't agree with your politics, and I don't feel comfortable serving you in my restaurant." Silence. A heavy, waiting silence. A man at the counter set down his coffee cup with dull clink. A couple near the door exchanged looks. Talia stood frozen, gripping her notepad like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. J.D. let the words settle. He could argue. He could push back. He could remind Melissa that businesses weren't supposed to turn people away for their beliefs. Instead, he did something no one expected. He exhaled slowly, folded the menu, and placed it neatly back in its holder. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, measured. "I understand." Melissa flinched, just slightly, like she had braced herself for a fight and wasn't sure how to handle his calm. J.D. slid out of booth, adjusted his jacket, and met her gaze. "Thank you for your honesty." With that, he turned, walked to the door, and stepped into the crisp evening air, leaving behind a diner full of stunned silence. As J.D. sat behind the wheel of his car, he took a deep breath, his fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel. He could still hear the whispers inside, feel the weight of the rejection pressing against his chest. It would have been easy to retaliate, to make a scene, to call out Melissa publicly. Instead, he reached for his phone, not to post, not to rant, but to make a call. It rang 3 times before a voice picked up. "Hey, it's J.D. Remember that thing we talked about last month? I think I just found the perfect place." He glanced back at the diner, its golden lights glowing against the darkening sky. "Yeah," he said, a small smile forming. "Tomorrow works. This is going to surprise everyone. Before we continue, if this story has pulled you in, make sure to like this video and subscribe. You won't believe what happens next." Talia wiped down the counter, but her mind was still back at the booth where JD Vance had been sitting just minutes ago. The air inside Maple Creek Diner felt different. Thicker, heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. The customers who had witnessed the exchange between JD and Melissa were still talking in hushed tones, their glances flickering toward the door as if expecting him to return. But he wouldn't. He was gone. Melissa, arms crossed tightly over her chest, stood near the kitchen, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the register as if focusing on numbers could make her forget the tension still hanging in the room. She had done what she thought was right. But why didn't it feel like a victory? Talia wanted to say something, anything, but what could she say? She needed this job. She needed the paycheck, the tips, the stability, and yet something deep inside her felt unsettled. Did that just happen? A man at the counter muttered to his friend. Sure it did, the other replied, shaking his head. To turn a man away just for who he voted for? That don't sit right. She's got her reasons. Another voice chimed in. Her dad lost a farm years ago. She blames people like him. Still, the first man sighed. Ain't how we do things around here. Talia heard it all, and from the way Melissa's shoulders tensed, she did too. Then the bell above the door jingled again, snapping Talia's attention toward the entrance. But it wasn't J.D. Instead, a family walked in, 2 parents and their teenage son, oblivious of the strange energy in the room. Melissa straightened her apron, forced a smile, and grabbed a stack of menus. Welcome to Maple Creek Diner, she said, her voice steady, controlled. Sit anywhere you like. Talia watched as the moment passed. Just like that, life moved on. The diner resumed its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, J.D. wasn't finished with Maple Creek Diner. As he drove away, the radio played softly in the background, but he wasn't listening. His mind was replaying the moment. Melissa's tense stance, the way Talia had looked like she wanted to shrink into floor, the silence of the other customers as they processed what had just happened. He had been rejected, not for his actions, not for his words, but for who he was. He had spent years fighting battles in the political arena, debating policies, defending his beliefs. But this wasn't about a campaign. This was about a small-town diner, a place that should have been about good food and community, not division. He pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, killed the engine, and reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. It rang. Once. Twice. Then a voice picked up. JD? It's late. What's up? JD leaned back in his seat, eyes still on the Maple Creek sign glowing in his rear-view mirror. I've got an idea, he said, and I think it's going to change things around here. He didn't elaborate. Not yet. But something told him that this moment, the rejection, the silence, the whispers, was about to turn into something much bigger than anyone expected. Back at the diner, Talia's shift dragged on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened tonight wasn't over. When she finally walked home later that night, the streets were quiet. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright, but her thoughts were clouded. Her grandmother, Eliza, was waiting for her, sitting in her usual spot on the worn-out couch, knitting needles clicking softly. The old woman barely looked up as Talia entered. You're late? Eliza said, not unkindly. Yeah, Talia sighed, dropping her bag onto the table. Long night. Eliza finished a row of stitches before speaking again. You look troubled, sweetheart. Something happened? Talia hesitated. Then she sat down next to her grandmother and told her everything. Eliza listened without interrupting, nodding along as Talia explained how Melissa had turned JD Vance away, right there in front of the whole diner. When she finished, she expected her grandmother to say something comforting, something like, You did the right thing keeping quiet. But instead, Eliza just sighed and said, maybe that wasn't the right call. Talia blinked. What do you mean? Eliza set down her knitting and looked at her granddaughter with the same wise, knowing eyes that had guided her through childhood. Kindness doesn't mean agreeing with someone, she said. And it doesn't mean backing down, either, but refusing to serve a man a meal because of his beliefs. She shook her head. That's not the way I raised you. Talia swallowed hard. Melissa was just doing what she thought was right. She said she had to stand by her principles. Principles are important, Eliza agreed, but so is dignity. And turning a man away from a meal just because you don't like what he stands for. She paused. That's not taking a stand. That's shutting a door. Talia didn't know what to say. She had never questioned Melissa before, but tonight was different. And deep down, she knew her grandmother was right. What she didn't know was that JD Vance wasn't finished with Maple Creek Diner. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Talia arrived at Maple Creek Diner expecting business as usual. But the moment she turned the corner onto Main Street, she stopped in her tracks. A crowd had gathered outside the diner. At first, panic gripped her chest. Had JD posted about what happened? Had people come to protest? Her heart pounded as she hurried forward, scanning the faces in the crowd. But something was off. They weren't angry. They weren't holding signs. They were waiting. Some stood with coffee cups in hand, chatting as if they had been there for a while. Others leaned against their cars, checking their phones. A few looked like they had driven in from out of town. She pushed her way through. "Excuse me," she said, squeezing past a middle-aged woman who smiled at her. "You work here, right?" the woman asked. Talia nodded cautiously. "Is it true," she continued, "did JD Vance recommend this place?" Talia's eyes widened. "What?" The woman pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward her. There, on social media, was a photo of the diner, its blue awning, the neon open sign glowing in the window. Below it, JD Vance's words stood out in bold print. "Was turned away from this little gem in Oakwood last night because the owner didn't agree with my politics. Respect her right to refuse service. But trust me, folks, this place smells amazing. If you're in the area, give it a try. Support local businesses, even when they don't support you." Talia barely registered the murmurs around her as she read the post again. He had sent people to the diner after being kicked out, after Melissa had publicly rejected him. He wasn't calling for a boycott. He wasn't demanding an apology. He had done something completely unexpected, and it was working. A news van suddenly pulled up across the street. A reporter stepped out, fixing his tie, adjusting the microphone clip to his shirt. Talia felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just a crowd. This was a story. She rushed inside, slamming the door behind her. The bell jangled violently, making Melissa jump from behind the counter. "What the... Talia, what's wrong? You haven't seen it yet?" Talia gasped, pulling out her phone. Melissa frowned. "Seen what?" Talia turned the screen toward her boss. Melissa took one look, and her face paled. She read it once. Then again. That... Melissa started, then stopped. She ran a hand through her hair, clearly overwhelmed. "He's sending people here?" "It looks that way," Talia said cautiously. Melissa's jaw clenched. "Is this some kind of trick? Some way to make me look bad?" "I don't think so," Talia said. "It sounds like forgiveness." Melissa scoffed. "Nobody's that nice, especially not in politics." The bell above the door jingled again, and a young couple stepped inside, looking around eagerly. "Hi," the man said. "We saw JD Vance's post. Thought we'd stop by for breakfast." Melissa hesitated for half a second before slipping into business mode. She grabbed 2 menus and forced a polite smile. "Right this way," she said. As she seated them, she turned to Talia. "We need to start cooking." Talia nodded, but as she tied on her apron, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. The diner becomes a sensation. Within an hour, every table was full. Melissa had to call in extra staff, and even then, they were struggling to keep up. The griddle was constantly sizzling. Coffee pots were emptying faster than they could be refilled, and the phone kept ringing. People asking if the diner really was the one from JD's post. By noon, there was a waiting list. By evening, news outlets were reporting on the Maple Creek Diner controversy. Some called JD's response a masterclass in grace and forgiveness. Others speculated whether it was a clever political move. But no matter what side people took, one thing was undeniable. The diner was now the most talked about restaurant in the county. Melissa, overwhelmed and exhausted, retreated to back office at the end of the night. Talia knocked before stepping inside, finding her boss sitting at her desk, staring at a stack of receipts. Melissa didn't look up. "We made more today than we usually make in a week." "That's good, right?" Melissa exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't know. Maybe. Probably." She finally looked up at Talia, her expression unreadable. Why would he do this? Talia thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe he just wanted to prove a point," she said. "That kindness wins." Melissa let out a tired laugh. "Nobody's that nice," she repeated. But this time, she didn't sound as sure. JD Vance sat in his car outside the diner, the engine idling as his mind raced through the events of the night. He could have fought back. Most people in his position would have. He could have walked out, posted a scathing message, and let the weight of his influence crush a small-town restaurant overnight. But he didn't. Instead, he made a phone call. "Hey," he said when the voice on the other end picked up. "Remember that thing we talked about last month? I think I found the perfect place." There was a long pause. Then, "Are you sure?" JD looked back at the glowing diner sign. Inside, he could see Melissa talking to her customers, explaining her decision, defending it. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. And then there was Talia, the waitress who had looked torn, as if she didn't know which side of the moment she wanted to be on. "Yeah," JD said. "I'm sure." He hung up, put the car in gear, and drove away. At that moment, the story could have ended. But the real story? It was just beginning. The ripple effect. The next morning, Maple Creek Diner opened as usual. The same coffee brewed. The same plates clattered in the kitchen. The same locals filled the booths, chatting about everything and nothing. Melissa carried on as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, and it started with Talia. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Turning someone away is a serious thing. It says, "You're not welcome here." She had never thought of it that way before. Now, she couldn't think of it any other way. When she arrived for her morning shift, she half expected JD to have retaliated, to see angry comment online, a campaign calling for the diner's closure, or reporters waiting at the door. But none of that happened. Instead, something entirely different unfolded. At 6:30 a.m., the diner's first rush began. The bell jingled. The regulars took their seats, and Talia got to work. But then new customers started showing up, and more, and more. By 7 a.m., a line had formed outside. By 8 a.m., they had run out of coffee twice. By 9 a.m., they had the biggest morning rush in the diner's history. And that's when Melissa saw the post. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, expecting another news article or comment thread tearing her apart. But instead, she saw something she never could have predicted. A social media post from JD Vance. The image? A simple photo of Maple Creek Diner, its blue awning bright against the morning sun. The caption? Was turned away from this little gem last night because the owner didn't agree with my politics. Respect her right to refuse service. But trust me, folks, their meatloaf special smelled amazing, and everyone inside looked happy. Small businesses are the heart of America, even when they don't want my business. If you're in the area, give Maple Creek Diner a try and form your own opinion. Support local. Always. Melissa read it twice. Then a third time. She could hardly believe it. He hadn't attacked her. He hadn't encouraged hate. He had done the exact opposite. And now, because of him, business was booming. Talia, peering over Melissa's shoulder, exhaled sharply. He's sending people here, she whispered. Melissa set her phone down, rubbing her forehead. Why? Why would he do that? She had publicly embarrassed him, turned him away, and made a point of rejecting him. And in return, he had given her restaurant the best business it had seen in years. The day continued in a blur. Orders flew in. The kitchen struggled to keep up. By lunchtime, they had a full house and a waiting list. It wasn't just a busy day. It was a turning point. And Melissa, for the first time, she didn't know what to do. By the end of the lunch rush, Maple Creek Diner had never been busier. The usual lull between meals never came. Instead, the diners kept arriving. More people, more conversations, more plates stacked high with Melissa's homemade meatloaf and cornbread. For the first time in years, the place felt alive. But Melissa, she felt like she was drowning. Every time a customer walked in, she flinched, expecting someone to confront her. Every time someone mentioned JD Vance's name, her stomach twisted. And every time her phone buzzed, she hesitated before looking, because the messages weren't stopping. Some were supportive. You stood your ground. Respect. Proud of you for sticking to your beliefs. Others were furious. You just lost my business forever. Disgusting. I hope your diner fails. And some were just confused. Why is JD promoting your diner after you kicked him out? Melissa wished she had an answer. At 3 p.m., the lunch rush finally slowed. For the first time all day, she had a moment to breathe. She retreated to her tiny office, shut the door, and collapsed into her chair. She had expected JD to retaliate. She had braced for it, prepared for it. But what she hadn't prepared for, kindness, that's what unsettled her the most. Because kindness meant she had been wrong. A knock at the door startled her. Talia peeked in, holding a cup of fresh coffee. You okay? Melissa let out a long breath. I don't know. Talia set the coffee down carefully. It's been a day. Melissa gave a short laugh. That's one way to put it. There was a long pause. Then, finally, Melissa admitted it. I don't understand why he did this. Talia sat down across from her. Because that's who he is. Melissa shook her head. No one is that nice. No one forgives that easily, especially in politics. Talia studied her boss carefully. Maybe he's not just a politician. Melissa let that thought settle. Maybe this wasn't a strategy. Maybe this wasn't a trick. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, someone had chosen grace over resentment. And maybe she wasn't ready for that. The media storm begins. The first news crew arrived just before dinner service. Melissa barely had time to react before a man in a press suit and a camera crew barged through the door. Melissa Hargrove? The reporter's voice was slick, rehearsed. Melissa blinked. Who's asking? Camden Walsh, Channel 8 News. We'd love to get your response to JD Vance's post and this unexpected turn of events. Melissa's stomach dropped. She hadn't even begun to process what had happened. And now reporters wanted answers? Talia stepped up beside her. We're not giving interviews. Camden didn't back down. The public wants to know, why would JD Vance recommend a diner that refused to serve him? Do you regret your decision? A camera zoomed in on Melissa's face. Talia could feel her boss's tension rising. Melissa took a breath, calming herself. No comment, she said firmly. Camden smirked. That's what you want to go with. Melissa didn't hesitate. That's my answer. She turned on her heel and walked away. But the news crew didn't leave. They took a seat at the counter, ordered coffee, and kept watching. Within an hour, 3 more news vans pulled up outside. By morning, Melissa's story was national news. The unexpected divide. The next day, the Maple Creek diner was still packed, but the customers had changed. The regulars were still there, sipping their coffee and reading the paper. But mixed in were new faces, people who had driven from towns over just to be part of the moment. Some came to support Melissa. You did the right thing. You shouldn't have to serve someone you don't agree with. Others came to support JD. This is what America should be, different views but mutual respect. And some just came to watch the chaos unfold. By mid-morning, arguments had already started between customers. One man at the counter loudly told another, this place should be shut down. Another fired back, you don't get it. He turned the other cheek. That's what makes this incredible. Melissa heard it all, and with every heated discussion, she realized something. Her diner wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a symbol, a battleground, and she had no idea how to handle it. By the 3rd day, the news cycle was relentless. Cable networks ran segment after segment, dissecting the situation from every angle. Some called Melissa a hero. She stood her ground. Business owners should have the right to refuse service to politicians they disagree with. Others painted her as a villain. She turned away a paying customer based on his beliefs. If the roles were reversed, there would be outrage. But what no one expected was how deeply divided the public reaction became. Outside the diner, supporters and critics clashed. Protesters arrived. Some held signs defending Melissa's right to refuse service. Others held signs praising JD Vance for taking the high road. It was no longer about one moment in a small-town diner. It was a national debate. The unexpected consequences. Melissa stayed off social media, but Talia couldn't help checking her phone. The diner's page had thousands of new comments. We're driving 2 hours just to support you, Melissa. JD is the bigger person. You should be ashamed of how you treated him. You're what's wrong with America. Melissa's email inbox was full. Letters flooded the restaurant. The phone rang constantly. Then, the businesses nearby started feeling the pressure. The hardware store next door reported getting calls asking if they supported Melissa's decision. The bakery down the street had customers walk in and ask, "Where you stand?" The town was splitting in two. And Melissa? She felt like she was losing control. Melissa reaches a breaking point. By Thursday afternoon, the diner had a line out the door. Melissa moved through the crowd, but her hands were shaking. Every order, every interaction felt tense. At 3 p.m., she stepped into the back, away from the noise. Talia followed. "Are you okay?" Melissa didn't answer. She just stared at the counter, gripping the edge. "This isn't what I wanted," she whispered. "I just wanted to run a diner." Talia hesitated, then finally said what she had been holding back. "Then maybe it's time to change the narrative." Melissa looked at her, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Talia gestured toward the dining room. "Right now, this isn't about you. It's about the fight people want to have around you." Melissa sighed, rubbing her temples. "And how do I stop that?" Talia took a deep breath. You need to talk to him. Melissa froze. JD? Talia nodded. He's the only person who can change this conversation. You have to decide. Do you want this to be a battle or a lesson? Melissa didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out JD's letter, the one she had read and reread for days. Maybe Talia was right. Maybe it was time to end the fight before it destroyed everything. The decision that shocked everyone. The next morning, Melissa made a call. Not to a news station, not to a lawyer, to JD Vance. She didn't know if he'd answer, but he did, and what she said next would change everything. Melissa sat at the counter, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over JD Vance's contact. Talia stood beside her, arms crossed, watching. You don't have to do this, Talia said carefully. But if you do, don't do it because you feel forced. Do it because you want to fix this. Melissa exhaled sharply. I don't know if I want to fix this. I want my diner back. She hesitated for another long second. Then she pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he picked up. A different kind of conversation. Melissa. JD's voice was even, steady. He wasn't angry, just curious. Melissa cleared her throat. I didn't expect you to answer. I figured you might call. JD said, What's on your mind? Melissa glanced at Talia, who gave her an encouraging nod. I think this whole thing has gotten out of hand, she admitted. I never meant for it to turn into whatever this is. JD was quiet for a moment. Melissa, I don't hold anything against you. I respected your right to run your business however you saw fit. That's why I never called for a boycott. Melissa ran a hand through her hair. I know, and I don't understand that. What don't you understand? She swallowed. Why you did what you did. Why you sent people my way instead of turning them against me. JD chuckled softly. Because anger doesn't build anything, Melissa. It just burns things down. Melissa closed her eyes for a moment. That truth hit her harder than she expected. For a long time, she had carried her father's resentment, turning it into her own. She had told herself she was just standing by her beliefs. But maybe she had been carrying a burden that was never meant to be hers. The offer no one expected. What do you want to happen now? JD asked. Melissa thought about that. For the first time in weeks, she let herself be completely honest. I want to run my diner. I want people to stop fighting about what happened. And she hesitated. I want to apologize. Not just to you, to everyone. JD didn't sound surprised. I think that's a great idea, he said. Would you be open to talking? Not privately, publicly. A conversation, not a statement. Just 2 people sitting down and proving we can still listen to each other. Melissa's stomach twisted. You mean in front of people? Yes. Not for drama. Not for politics. Just a real conversation. Melissa's first instinct was to say no. She had spent her whole life avoiding the spotlight. But then she thought about everything Talia had said, everything JD had done, and she realized something. If she truly wanted to move forward, she couldn't hide behind her fears anymore. She took a deep breath. Okay, she said, let's do it. The announcement. An hour later, Melissa stood in the back office of the diner, staring at a draft of her social media post. It was simple, honest. This has gone beyond what I ever expected. I made a mistake in how I handled things, and I want to have a real conversation about it. JD Vance and I will be sitting down to talk. No cameras, no scripts, just a discussion. If you want to listen, you're welcome to join us. Let's start bridging the divide instead of making it wider. She looked at Talia. What do you think? Talia smiled. I think people need to hear it. Melissa exhaled, hesitated for only a second more. Then she hit post. And within minutes, the internet exploded. The day of the conversation arrived faster than Melissa had anticipated. She had barely slept the night before. What if she said the wrong thing? What if people twisted her words? But there was no backing out now. The small community center, usually used for town meetings, had been set up with rows of folding chairs. It wasn't a massive crowd, just locals, some curious, some skeptical, but all waiting to see what would happen. Melissa took a deep breath as she walked toward the front, spotting JD already seated, waiting. He looked up and smiled. Nervous? Melissa let out a shaky laugh. Terrified. JD gestured to the two empty chairs. Good. That means you care. A town divided, or maybe not. As they sat, the murmurs in the room quieted. JD leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but direct. I think the first thing people want to know, he said, is why. Melissa swallowed hard, gripping her hands together in her lap. I was angry, she admitted. Not just at you, at politicians, at the system, at the way my family lost everything when I was younger. She hesitated, then glanced at the crowd. But I realize now that anger doesn't always hit the right target. There were nods in the audience. Some faces softened. Some remained skeptical. JD nodded. I understand that more than you know. I grew up in a family that felt forgotten, too. That's why I do what I do. Melissa exhaled. I think I made a mistake in how I handled things. Not because I was wrong for having my opinions, but because I let them make me bitter. The room was silent. Then a single clap. It came from the back. Then another, and another, until half the room was clapping. Not for JD, not for Melissa, but for the fact that they were even having this conversation. Breaking the cycle, a man in the front row stood. You know what's crazy? He said. I used to come to this diner every Sunday with my dad. After the whole mess, I stopped coming because I didn't want to support the drama. Melissa braced herself. But this? The man gestured to the room. This makes me want to come back. A woman nearby nodded. We're so used to people just yelling at each other. It's nice to see someone actually trying to fix things. JD turned to Melissa. So where do we go from here? Melissa glanced at Talia in the audience, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. We keep talking, Melissa said. We stop making assumptions about people before we get to know them. And we remember that this diner, she looked around, it's here to serve everyone. For the first time in weeks, Melissa felt light. She wasn't carrying her father's anger anymore. She wasn't carrying fear. She had let it go, and somehow, against all odds, a simple act of kindness had changed everything. Before we wrap up this incredible story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Stories like these deserve to be shared, and your support helps bring more unexpected and inspiring moments to life. Now, let's get to the final chapter. The sun had set by the time the conversation at the community center ended. People lingered, some still talking, some shaking hands, and others simply reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Melissa stood by the door, watching his neighbors, some who hadn't spoken in years, exchange words, small smiles, and maybe even the first steps towards something different. JD was still inside, helping stack chairs, even though no one had asked him to. Talia walked up beside Melissa. That went better than I expected. Melissa let out a small laugh. You and me both. For weeks, she had feared this moment, the public conversation, the judgment, the uncertainty. But now, as she looked around, she realized something. It had never been about winning or losing. It had been about understanding, a new beginning. The next morning, Melissa arrived at Maple Creek Diner before sunrise. The neon open sign buzzed softly in the window. The world outside was still quiet, but inside, the familiar scent of fresh coffee filled the air. She walked through the kitchen, running her hand along the counter, a counter that now had history. The place where an argument had started was now the place where a conversation had changed everything. As she was prepping for the morning rush, the front door jingled. She looked up. JD Vance stood in the doorway, holding a newspaper under his arm. Melissa smirked. "You're early." JD shrugged. "Figured I'd beat the rush." Melissa nodded toward his usual booth. "Go ahead and sit. Coffee's on the house today." JD raised an eyebrow. "Now that's a surprise." Melissa just smiled. "Call it an investment in the future." What the story teaches us. As Melissa poured JD's coffee, something became clear. This wasn't just about a restaurant, a politician, or even a town. It was about what happens when people choose kindness over conflict, when they listen before they judge, when they decide that division isn't the only option. And maybe, just maybe, it was proof that one simple act of grace can change everything. Because in the end, the most powerful moments aren't always loud. Sometimes they're as quiet as a shared meal in a small-town diner where two people, once divided, found common ground. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more content just like this. And if you've ever experienced a moment where kindness changed everything, share in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, remember, even the smallest act of understanding can build a bridge where there was once only a wall.